Welcome to Faithfully Living, the podcast, where we learn how to live for Christ in our daily lives. I am Dwan, your host, and I would like to invite you on a journey with me to explore and learn how to be a faithful follower of Christ. Everyone, welcome to Faithfully Living, the podcast, where we strive to encourage you to live for Christ faithfully. We're offering guidance on how to study the Bible, how to understand the Bible better, and how to remain faithful to historic Christianity in a contemporary society. So, understanding the history and cultures behind a country and a nation, can make it come alive. And Egypt has a prominent role in the narrative of the Bible. We know about the narratives about Abraham and Sarah in Egypt in Genesis 12:10 through 20. And then we have the story of Joseph. It is a major biblical narrative that spans from Genesis 37 to 50. We have the Israelites, in Egypt. And this story, details the latter part of Genesis through Exodus. And then the book of Exodus, mainly chapters 1 through 15, tells the story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt. And in the flight to Egypt in the New Testament, where we can find that in Matthew 2:13 through 15, records the account of Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus fleeing to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre of the infants. So you can see how there are a number of passages in the Bible, and I'm pretty sure I didn't touch on all of them, that has the setting of Egypt in it. And in this episode, I get to talk with Erika Brown. She's an archaeology student. And we talk about Egypt and how it relates to the Bible. And it was a very interesting conversation. I can't wait to share it with you. But before we get started with our conversation, let me tell you a little bit about Erika. All right, Erika is an archaeologist, educator, content creator, nerd, mom, wife, and believer. She was a preacher's daughter in a small town. She is an Army veteran. She loves archaeology, especially that of the Bible, and her goal is to bring it to culture. As an ongoing scholar, she is pursuing her PhD. She teaches college level courses, small groups, churches, and seminars. And she has a production company called JSYK Production. She produces educational videos on YouTube called Just So You Know. I'll put a link to that in the description so you can go and check those out. All right, let's dive into our conversation. Hi, Erika. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
All right, so before we get started on our topic here, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Like I said, my name is Erika. I am a biblical archaeologist. I have been studying and working on biblical archaeology for, oh my gosh, since 2016. So I've been doing it for some time now. I've had a chance to study in Israel and Egypt. So that's been really cool to do. I worked on a couple of sites in Israel, worked on 2 sites. One of the sites was Tel Gezer, connected to biblical Gezer, and then the other site is Tel Bernah, which we believe is biblical Libnah. And then I've also worked in Egypt at the Karnak Temple, working on Merneptah's wall, which is really interesting. So I'm currently working on my PhD in the Near East at Lipscomb University. So that's just a little bit about myself. Yeah.
All righty. Well, let's get into our topic. We're going to be talking about Egypt. So let's get to know a little bit about Egypt. So tell us a little bit about Egyptian culture.
So Egyptian culture, one of the things people have to realize is that Egyptian is distinct, but in general, it's a part of the ancient Near Eastern world.
Mm,
So it really fits into that the broad culture of the ancient Near East where things are so connected to the weather and the land, and those types of things dictate the movements and even beliefs. Egypt, as a part of the Fertile Crescent, it gets to do its own thing because of the Nile River. What's really key about Egypt is the Nile. The Nile empowers Egypt. It gives them the ability to be independent. They don't need other spaces like other countries in the other worlds in the ancient Near East. They really depend on each other. But Egypt, it doesn't have to because of the Nile. And that dictates so much of Egyptian culture. The Nile would flood and would produce so much rich soil, and that's why they can plant things. And then most Egyptians would relate that to the movement of their gods. So Egypt is really one of the key things to Egyptian culture is the Nile River, um, and they put that as a part of the order of things.
mm,
The gods would, as long as the pharaohs and the rulers maintain order, things would work out in the land, right? Um, if there's an expression that Egyptians maintain ma'at, M-A-A-T, it's like a maintaining of the orders. That was the pharaoh's job as the deity on earth, was to maintain the order. And so they would have whatever practices were set in place to maintain order. And the Nile, the movement of the Nile, whether if it's famine, if it's flooding, if it's doing all things, those things would communicate if the gods were pleased, and if Ma'at was being maintained. So a lot like other ancient Near cultures, yes, the weather, the land dictate the beliefs, but Egypt got to do its own thing in that way because of the Nile.
hmm So you talked a little bit about the climate as far
Mm-hmm.
as like the Nile River. What else was it like a rainy? Is it dry or like?
So Egypt, when you read Egyptian texts, they'll have the red land and the black land.
Mm,
All along the Nile, because of the flooding and everything, it would produce black soil, rich soil, right? That's the black land. And you can almost see it, even if you go there today, you can see the immediate break off into the red land. That's the desert area.
okay.
That's where the pyramids are part of the desert. Most of the tombs and burial sites, the really big ones, are in the
Hmm
desert part. So it's hot in the desert, but along the Fertile Crescent, I mean, along the Nile, excuse me, it's rich and beautiful and green. And you
mm
can even see that on the map today if you look on a like a world map satellite, and you can see how it's colorful along the Nile. But
Oh, okay.
then right outside, it's there's a red land, black land, like it's immediate.
Huh.
I tried to video it when I was in Egypt because you can just see it. We were up on a high space. You could see that immediate abrupt where the soil is not doing things and it goes into desert.
hmm
So it's really kind of cool and unique to see that it's red land and black land. And that's why they get the expression of the black Egypt. They're talking about the soil, the rich soil that comes from the overflowing in the Nile and that soil that spills over into the land. So that's the climate. They will have flooding seasons and they will grow based on those flooding seasons, and then just
hmm
wait for that continuous cycle where the Nile floods annually.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that kind of takes care of the geography just a little bit. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as far as is, I guess there's more red land than black land because the
It's so much more redland.
like where does the Nile fall within the geography of the Nile? Like, is it to one side mostly, or it does it cut through the middle of
It kind of
Egypt?
cuts down through the middle, all the way down Egypt. It runs. They have what's called the cataracts.
Okay.
The different turns in the Nile there. Anyway, it runs kind of down the center, and then at the end, at the northern part of Egypt, you'll see it break off into
Okay.
different rivers that break out into the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay.
So it runs down, but right at the coast of the Mediterranean, there are numerous
hmm
branches, water branches that break off from the Nile into the
Okay.
Mediterranean. Mhm.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. And then what about like the government and governmental structure? What was the politics like in Egypt?
Um, Up until the Romans, up until the Romans, because you know how the Romans be. Up until the Romans, it was a dynasty system, pharaohs.
Okay.
Um, and I talk about this a little bit in one of my videos, where if you were the pharaoh, they have Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, right? They split the north part of Egypt is called Lower, and the south part is called Upper because of the terrain. It dips down. The closer you get to the Mediterranean Sea, it dips down. That's why it's lower. But anyway,
Oh.
if you're the pharaoh of both parts, um, then you would wear the double crown. So you're the pharaoh over all of it. But then there were these periods where a dynasty, the last major dynasty, would die off, and then everybody's trying to fight for control. So you'll have multiple rulers in Egypt, but it's a pharaoh system, pharaonic, which was it's similar to a king, a Western concept of a king, except the pharaoh was the human manifestation of a deity, typically the deity
Oh.
Horus.
Hmm.
Um, he was once he became pharaoh, he was like the gods birthed him, and you'll see that a lot of the tombs and burial spaces where there's imagery of that pharaoh being conceived by a deity and birth into his deityness, and that's his role on earth is the human form of the deity god of the deity yours to maintain ma'at. So you follow in that system. And one of the things we have to realize is we are a culture where we get to see our leaders. Probably most Egyptians who served the government or worked for that government never even saw the pharaoh or knew they saw him. It's not a connectedness.
Hmm.
Um, it's probably one of those things. As long as whatever's working is working, it ain't no problem for us, right? They would have markers and stillas and different things to announce themselves as pharaohs and taking
Mm-hmm.
over or when they go through. But for the most part, that's what it was, a pharaohs governing Egypt, but governing in the space of the deity, maintaining that order. And they
Okay.
would have prophets that worked for the king that would help with communication between the deities and the pharaoh. So there are spaces of prophets, but then, like most governments, you have people that are running that you delegate different activities to that run different parts of the
The kingdom.
kingdom or empire,
Yeah.
if you will, like that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we kind of jumped into it a little bit about the religious views and beliefs of the Egyptians. So if they're saying like the pharaoh is a manifestation of a god,
Mm-hmm.
do they have multiple gods? Because they don't have duplicate pharaohs of the same god, do they?
No, they are polytheistic, like a lot of cultures in ancient Near East. And each god represents different parts of the way it comes across is they're different parts of nature or different parts of the world or different gods cover different things, right? So you would have the god of war, you would have the god of fertility, you would have the god of death, you would have the god of the sun. They would have different gods for different aspects of their life,
Mm-hmm.
and they would have sacrificial systems in place to sacrifice to whatever that need or thing that you need. You would sacrifice to that particular god. Um,
Okay.
the goddess Hathor, she was like military and fertility, not as, but you would sacrifice. She's the one. She has a. Sometimes she's often portrayed as a bull.
Okay.
Um, Even then, they would have these anthropomorphic, like these animal, the deity. So even the god Horus has a falcon shaped head. That's his look, his mama Isis and his dad Osiris. So they would have these different looks. Osiris is typically depicted as a black. You'll see him as the color black, noting he's super fertile, nod to his fertility. Um, there's quite a bit of them that they get from their that they established as their different deities that they would worship for whatever need they have. That's like it's broken up. So you didn't just serve the one for one thing. You would have to
Okay.
go through a number of them. The god Bes protects mothers and babies. He's the real funky looking one. He looks like a lion and monster type figure, but we find like amulets or different things that you would find with women or babies because
Mm-hmm.
he's the God that protects them.
Okay.
So that's how it works. You would go to whatever God fulfills whatever need. That's the one you would go to.
So did they have multiple temples for these gods or?
Oh my Lord, there are so many. It will be temples in the temples. Like there are so many temples. I worked at Karnak, which is started. It's a temple, Karnak Temple. It's a temple complex. There are so many temples at the site of Karnak in Luxor, Egypt. It's a temple complex.
Mm,
So it started as originally started as a temple to the god Amun, and the pharaoh of the time, I forget his name, built the temple to honor Amun and to document his victories. But then one of the pharaohs after him was like, "Ooh, I want to do that too. Let me add on to his temple, and I'm going to do my own little temple, another temple side room to honor Amun." And that's how the Karnak temple complex became so huge because all these
mm,
pharaohs would create all these different temples. They would attach more temples to the temples. Um, and most of the temples in the Karnak are dedicated to the god Amun. But there are others that are dedicated to different gods and goddesses in this temple complex. So it's so many different temples. It's one of those things that if a temple wasn't by you, you can build another temple, right? If you had the money, if you had the well-being, you
right.
had the, and so that you can honor that God, especially if that God offers something that you would need. So there
Mm,
are, oh my gosh, numerous temples upon temples in Egypt, north and south.
mm,
And then even as you get closer to Nubia, you'll see a merging of Egyptian gods and Nubian gods and building temples for those gods, merging them like that. So it's fascinating.
mm. Wow. That's a
Mhm.
lot to keep up with.
It is. I
They
was
have
like,
so many
to have to
needs
keep
and
in
so many
mind,
gods.
yeah, yeah, to keep in mind which God does which, and making sure you appease that God, and
Uh-huh.
even some of their traditions, a lot like what we see in Greek mythology. If those gods were beefing, like Seth was one of the deities, he was always called him. He's an Egyptian deity, but he was always beefing with all the other Egyptian gods. Like this, he's one of those they associate with evil. But it's different thing. But there is a temple for Seth. There's a temple dedicated to him. So it's like even managing that, the relationships between the deities and that connection. Like I cannot imagine. Like, ugh, it sounds exhausting.
Yeah, it does. I am
Mhm.
so grateful. I'm
Girl, that
grateful.
part.
Yeah. All right. So now that we know a little bit about the Egyptians, we see we have a number of narratives in the Bible that are set in Egypt. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of them, but we just wanted to kind of touch on some of the common ones, like maybe Joseph's story, the Israelites
Hmm.
in Egypt, and then Moses in Exodus. So let's start off with Joseph's story, like the culture, historical background within the story of Joseph when he was in
Yeah. So not Moses, Joseph typically is dated to around the end of the Middle Kingdom period of Egypt, or in the second intermediate period. That's usually where they hover with Joseph. There's a lot of debate that goes back and forth because at the end of the second intermediate period, one of the reasons it's a big deal is because at the end of the second intermediate, we have the ruling of the Hyksos. They're Hyksos rulers,
Mm-hmm.
and they come from the same cultural background as Joseph. They are Semitic people. They're Semitic
Mm-hmm.
Egyptian rulers. And so there's argument as to whether Joseph served under that rulership, or did Joseph work right before that rulership? There's discussion,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no one knows with certainty, but um, there is significance with we having Semitic Egyptian rulers. We even have like Egyptian documents that talk about high-ranking Semitic people serving in high spaces in Egypt. One of them is on display in the Brooklyn Museum. It lists Matter of fact, it has a number of Semitic names of a high-ranking Egyptian household, and it also lists that the different positions and demonstrates that Semitic people like Joseph or whoever, the
Mm-hmm.
people that come from that background. And when we say Semitic, we're talking about people that come from the region of Canaan, not Canaan specifically, but that region of Canaan. It's usually we call it the Levant, but Canaan, Syria, almost over to Mesopotamia. That area is usually what we associate with in terms of ancient culture,
Okay.
Semitic people.
Mm-hmm.
So Amorites were Semitic. Hittites were, no, Hittites were not. I'm sorry, they're not. But that area is where we submit. Anyway, so having people documented in Egyptian documents, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
these are Egyptian writings talking about Semitic people being in these spaces of affluence, like we see with Joseph. So it's awesome because it shows you that, okay, this is consistent. And most of these date, a lot of these ones that list these things date to that same time period that they associate with Joseph or these Semitic rulers. So it's awesome to have something like that to demonstrate that
Mm-hmm.
the Bible's not making up a Semitic person. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, we can't, how would you know that somebody of that background would get up so high in position in Egypt? Well, we have Egyptian documents saying this, talking about these same sorts of things, people moving up in the ranks this way.
Right.
One of the cool things about the Joseph one, and I had a little note, when he was sold into slavery, uh, they actually have things that talk about the cost of slaves during that time. There are Egyptian documents that highlight that because his brothers sold him. And by the way, they sold him to a caravan of people coming in and out of Egypt doing trade. And there's documentation for that of people coming in and out of Egypt for trade purposes, like what we see in Joseph. Um, but with Joseph's being sold, his price. So he was sold for 20 shekels. He was sold for 20 shekels. We have documentation that during that time period, um, it's consistent with the price of slaves during that time period for
Mm-hmm.
the same time period. Later on, slaves are sold for 50 to 60 shekels. So even his selling price is consistent with the time period, which is important for a number of reasons. One, to write that down, to document that, you would have to be a person
Right.
familiar with these numbers. Like, oh, one of the accusations is that this was made up or written later to give a history. Well, details like that talk about the price of a slave, the cost to be sold, and things like that, like a small thing like that, and to be accurate and consistent with one time period. We don't
Mm-hmm.
show pricing for slaves in other time periods after this for 20 shekels. So that number is consistent with that time period. It matches that time period. So it's small things like that. I think it's fascinating to highlight the historicity of the text. Like,
Right.
okay, it fits within that narrative. So not only do we have documents of Semitic workers, but we have pricing of slaves, the trading and buying of Egyptian slaves at that time, matching in the Joseph narrative. Um, so it's little things like that. I do have to tell people there's no archaeological proof for the story of Joseph, right? And that's okay because archaeology doesn't work that way. Um, you don't have archaeology that's set out to prove everyday individuals, or it doesn't even work that way anyway. Archaeology is not meant to prove things. It's about documenting and collecting information. But
Okay.
it's awesome when we can document things and collect data where we know about the cost of slaves, and we can use that and compare that and like see this supports what we have.
Mm-hmm.
This supports what we have in the text, right? So with Joseph's narrative, that's one of the important things. We do have documentation of a lot of famine, different seasons of famine, and again, that's dictated by the Nile. Um, and even Joseph's management of storing food
Mm-hmm.
comes from someone writing down that's familiar with the seasons and the agricultural processes of Egypt.
Right.
Because like I said, it's a unique situation. Nile and the growing in the Nile is unique to Egypt because of the Nile River. Like that's amazing to see that. So that's one of the things we see with the Joseph, with the Joseph narrative in particular.
And then what about the Israelites in Egypt?
The Israelites
Like
again,
being slaves in Egypt, like during that time.
yeah. So we have documents of Semitic workers working for the Egyptian government. We have documentation of Semitic people being taken captive and
Mm,
becoming workers for the Egyptian government. Like these are depicted on walls in Egyptian texts. So it's not without the realm of, it's not something that's inconsistent with what we see. Matter of fact, most of the time, those type of people, Semitic people, they have their own distinct depictions. They're often depicted with, when it's color, they'll have an auburn or reddish hair. They have a beard, and they also always typically have these headbands.
mm,
Um, that's a distinctly for that type of people group. The Egyptians would depict different people groups different ways, but
oh,
with Semitic people, Asiatic people is what they call them. They would have you would see them, and they would have the multicolor um,
mm,
robes and cloths, which is again when we
huh.
talk about Joseph and his
Coat of,
multicolored robe,
yeah.
it's consistent with that culture, that particular culture, people from that area. But anyway, sorry. With the Israelites, again, there is no archaeological proof that says the Israelites were here. Um, but we do find uh, Semitic cities, Semitic villages, specifically because we know from the pottery and the type of things that we find there that these belong to this specific people group that
Hmm.
lived and worked for the Egyptian kingdom, but they lived in this space in Egypt. So we do have that. There's this connection too with, and with the Israelites, that narrative typically falls with what we call the New Kingdom period of Egypt.
Okay.
Um, there's debate about the dates. There's two major arguments. There's a low date and a high date, but both within the realm of the one is at the end of the second intermediate period, and one is right in the New Kingdom, but it's still relatively in that same time period. But
Hmm.
um, there is the cities. A number of the cities listed in the text are been documented. Egyptologists have been able to identify a number of the cities mentioned in
Okay.
the Israelite accounts. And but there's no mention of them specifically except the Merneptah stela, but that's sometime after the Exodus, right? But Merneptah is the only Egyptian that references the Israel in particular. But before Merneptah, we don't have any reference to them, but we do have depictions and Egyptian text references to Semitic people like the Israelites. The Israelites would
Hmm.
be considered a Semitic people. Um, Even when we look at the Exodus, um, there's a number of debate. A lot of scholars I've read, they don't take the Red Sea as the literal Red Sea as we would. It's more so like reed,
Okay.
but it may have been more descriptive than name as well, because in ancient times the reed marshy area would have connected the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, and up all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. So it would have been more water there. But what there's different water levels. There's people who are studying those different water levels.
Hmm.
But one of the interesting things about the Exodus account is there is I believe it's called an oceanographer. I butcher the name. People who study the water contents, water
Yeah,
levels,
I think that's right.
um, hydrologist. There it is. Sorry, hydrologist. Um, there's a hydrologist who did a study on so you know where Israel ends and right where Sinai, it's a plate, a tectonic plate, right?
Okay.
He did a study on the water under these plates.
Hmm.
And long story short, the sulfur readings for that water that builds up under these plates and pushes to the surface, the sulfur is so high that it creates a bitter taste in the water. And again, when we read the Exodus accounts, they complain about the water being bitter. when they're crossing over. They're like, oh, this water is gross, right? Again, to know that you would have to be in that space. Like that's not a,
Right. Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
So it's different information like that. I think helps to. We may not have direct archaeological evidence for the Exodus, but small details like the bitter water. Um, One of the things is there's two major quail patterns. There's a researcher who looked at quail patterns. So you remember in the Exodus account, they were eating quails.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There is
They're in
a
the wilderness. Yeah.
there's a major quail migration pattern. There's a researcher that documents it, and there's that pattern will take the quail through the Sinai at one part of the
Oh.
cycle. Yeah,
Huh.
I know,
Wow.
right? And then it takes them a different spot throughout their cycle, their
Uh-huh.
migration cycle. Again, it's such a small thing. You would have to have been in that space. You have had to have experienced that to know that there's a quail cycle, a migration cycle that comes through there.
Uh-huh.
So I said all to say is, yeah, there's not direct, but man, these small little details, these towns being identified, Semitic workers, documentations of Semitic peoples working in Egypt. There's a tomb scene of brick making in one of the high ranking government officials in his tomb. And this scene depicts almost verbatim what is described in the book of Exodus of what the Israelites were doing to make these bricks
Huh.
for the buildings. And we know a lot of in ancient Near Eastern period, and a
Uh-huh.
lot of structures in Egypt are built with mud brick, which is
Right.
what the Israelites were doing, were
Mm-hmm.
making. And yeah, this relief shows the process. It shows an Egyptian worker counting, documenting the process, how many bricks they're making. So it's just this very awesome detail, small detail things that
Right. Yeah.
found Egyptologists and Egyptian archaeologists have found that supports or demonstrates that whoever wrote the Bible had to be pretty familiar with
Right.
these
Yeah.
different things, right? And so I've always think that's awesome.
Yeah. Especially well, because they say they think Moses wrote like Genesis, Exodus. So with those things, those small details, he would have to, since he lived in Egypt, part of his, he grew up there, he would
Yeah,
have to know like those specific details
yeah.
in order
Moses
to
Moses is even an
document.
Egyptian name. You know, when
Mm-hmm.
they did a study on the words of different, you know how we'll have loan words in English. So pizza is not an English word,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a word we use as English speakers, right? But we
Right.
know that it's not. It's Italian. Don't quote me on that. I'm not familiar, but I think it's Italian. Anyway, that's called a loan word. They looked at all the Egyptian loan words in the Bible, and the vast majority of them are found in Exodus, right?
Hmm.
Versus Aramaic, which is the language of the Persians, the vast majority of the loan words are found in the later books, Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, right? So even that type of thing where
Right.
someone had to be familiar enough to use all of these Egyptian words to have these
Mm-hmm.
different Egyptian expressions,
Right.
you would have to be familiar with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For
So it's
sure.
it's fascinating to see that in the common name of Moses being there's even things of Semitic people being taken in and taught to learn how to write Egyptian and write in an Egyptian way and learn
Mm-hmm.
Egyptian things. So that's not even a stretch. So it's consistent with what we've seen in the archaeological record that these were common things. So everything that we see accounted for in the book of Exodus and in Genesis with Joseph, it's not something that's not far fetched. That's not something that we don't see in the archaeological
Right.
record. So it's just really comforting and it's just helpful. And even it helps us understand those contexts, why they're making the
Right.
moves because this is a part of this culture. This is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Definitely so. Wow. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a researcher. He looked at the in that same region, Egypt, Sinai region. the way the water can be stored in the rocks. And there are shepherds who know, hey, if you tap the rock, certain rocks a certain way, or you know which one, you know
Ah,
you're going to get water out of them.
okay.
What's interesting is because we've always read the narrative where Moses taps the rock
Mm-hmm.
and he taps it. And then in the story, we have to look at the details. Yahweh told him the miracle wasn't the water coming out, him tapping the rock. The last time Moses was supposed to speak to the rock, but he didn't do that. What did he do? He tapped, he did the regular way. So he got in trouble because he
Right.
tapped it when God told him to speak to it. It's no thing
Uh-huh.
for it to tap the rock. I know how to turn a faucet on. But baby, what happens when I speak to the faucet and the water comes out, right? It's
Uh-huh.
that of God was supposed to be glorified in this moment, but you didn't do that. You was getting caught up in your feelings and you didn't do what you're supposed to do. So it's even in
Wow.
small stuff like that, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I see how the text is moving. It was about Moses failing to, as a leader, as what God has told you to do, you are failed to do it. And showed up in the space. I wanted to show these people that, but you didn't. You were caught up in your feelings.
Right.
So
Yeah.
everybody know about the tap in the rock. That's not special. What would have been special is you speak into that rock and water coming out.
Huh.
Right?
I did not
Yeah.
know that. That is that's an interesting an interesting
Yeah.
fact there.
There are people who do hydrologists. I mean, I didn't even know there was a thing, but people who were studying these types of things, and you would have to. It makes sense because there are Bedouin people who live out in these desert areas, and you're like,
Mhm.
even if you go to Israel, in the wilderness area, the desert area of Israel, there are people who live out there.
Mm.
They can live out there is because they know about the different oases, the different water sources in that area, so they know where to draw from. But it'd be
Right.
no different in the Sinai region or whatever desert region. You would to live out there, you would have to know those things.
Mhm. Yeah.
And again, that shows the writer. That writer would have to be familiar with this process of drawing water from rocks,
Right. And the
right?
area and where to
Mhm.
go.
Yeah.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
This has been a very insightful conversation.
Yeah.
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 I
I
didn't
tell people we get so caught up in they found a wagon wheel in the Red Sea, which is not that's not real. It's not true. We gotta let that one go. We get caught up. We're trying to see these things, but I think
Mhm.
all of these smaller, they're not
Right.
small. I think they're
Mhm.
super dope. These smaller things offer so much more to me.
Yeah. Like the details, the
Yeah,
details of
yeah.
things like the selling of the slave for 20, you said
20
20
shekels.
shekels, or knowing the environment, like the shepherd's tapping on the rock is something that
Yeah.
is already like built in and then to just
Uh-huh.
let it flow. So yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, because with the 20 shekels, think about it. If this is coming from a person who's writing hundreds of years later, um, they would have put the price, if they're making it up, by the way, too,
Right.
you would have put the price, that price at that time. They like to say that those accounts were written at least during the exile or after the exile, and that's when the cost of a slave to Egypt is at 50 to 60 shekels. Well, if you're
Mhm.
writing something and you're making something up, you would put that number.
Right.
You don't have the number of a slave past that period. Like those numbers wouldn't match. You see what I'm saying? Like it's
Mhm.
like okay, someone knows something
Right.
someone is getting some account that has experienced this space in some way. You
Mhm.
have to acknowledge that. That's so I always offer that. What do I do with that information? That's you want to say it's made up, but where are they getting this accurate data? Where are they getting this
Right.
accurate information? There has to be some type of either documented or verbal tradition that knows these things, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, could you tell us like you've told us so many other good fun facts about Egypt, but is there a fun fact about Egypt that you'd like to share with us that since you've been studying Egypt?
Oh, let me see. Fun fact about Egypt. I don't know. There's so many of them. Let me see here. Or so many that I've already shared, let me say. Um, ah, I just think the visually to see Egypt, yeah, to see it in person really adds so much to our understanding. Like I said, with the black land, red land thing, to
Uh-huh.
me, those types of things are fascinating because wow, you can see what they're talking about. and you're like, okay, I kind of get what you visually see it like. No, I'll give you my favorite. One of my favorite pharaohs is the female pharaoh Hathor. Hatshepsut. And so it was really cool to see her temple. He even made a temple, her temple that she constructed, and how she depicted herself, how determined she was to be respected.
Mm.
But then whoever was right behind her didn't like what she did, so they destroyed a lot of her work. So that's always interesting. But it shows you that there's significant female leadership,
Okay.
um, female rulers, and she was probably more dominant than Nefertiti. But we always hear about Nefertiti.
Right. Yeah.
That was interesting when I learned about her. I was like, why is everybody talking about Nefertiti? Hatshepsut did way more than Nefertiti. So I think what surprised me is what's highlighted versus what's talked about versus what's not,
Mm-hmm.
and that's always been most surprising.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up here. Our last question is, what encouragement could you offer, believers that want to live faithfully for Christ?
My encouragement would be we may start to always ask God to increase your faith. Um, I know things happen. We see things in our life. We read things. There are so many people that are against your faith. But I would always ask God to restore your faith, maintain your faith, build your faith, because that does so much more for when you're doing life and life is life, and you
Mm.
can stand on your faith. You can stand on what you believe. And as God sends you more and more, He will affirm your faith. He will build your faith. So that's usually always my big encouragement, because that's what He did for me. I remember this journey I started. It has built my faith and strengthened my faith in so many ways that when things are bad or hard or whatever, I can stand on that faith. So
Mm.
that's usually always my encouragement.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
No, thank you for having me. I've said it before, I love nerding out. So that's always
Yeah.
awesome.
All right. Well, take care. Wasn't that a fascinating conversation about Egypt and how knowing just the detail of the things that they find in Egypt, the stories of the Egyptians as they documented like what happened, and then how archaeologists can, go and dig up and see what a culture was like during that time. I especially found the science, or I don't even know if you would call science, but just the fact that the shepherds could tap on the rock and then they could get water out of it. So it makes that story of Moses and Israel in the wilderness just come alive, as far as, you can see how God works. He doesn't work in the ordinary, mundane. Well, he does, but he works supernaturally. So the things that would naturally occur, God, because he is the creator of everything, he can circumvent the natural occurring processes. Say for instance, when Moses and the Israelites and Joshua were fighting, I can't remember what nation that they were fighting, or it might have been Joseph. Either way, God allowed the sun not to go down. Of course, that's something supernatural that happened. Or, like we were talking about in our episode, how the shepherds could tap on the rock and then the water would flow. But God wanted to do something, supernatural. He wanted Moses to talk to the rock, and then the water would flow. So it just goes back to, seeing like the character and nature of God, and how God has given us the Bible as not only a narrative but also a guide, and to show up and to show us who he is, even though it might not be, may not give us all the answers that we want, but God gives us enough to show us who he is, and that he is all powerful, he's all knowing, he's sovereign, and that he is fully able to, take care of us. And that's always exciting. So I hope this episode about Egypt was fascinating for you as it was for me. If you want to, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. And remember, God is always good and is always faithful. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Do me a favor by following the podcast and leaving a review to help spread the word. I look forward to hearing from you.